Okay, so this is General Biology by 131, and this is part 2 of chapter 4, which is about the energy. And now we're talking about, we will continue to talk about the energy. And if you ever heard about the old spy, when in the old spy movies, when they catch an agent, sometimes he take a pill, and we call that the spy pill, and how this spy pill worked. It lead to death somehow, and because it contain a poison that's very fast, and we will talk about this. What does it mean, or what does it do? So we're talking about the cellular respiration. So respiration in general, when you ventilate, like you're breathing in and out, inhalation, exhalation, and so on. So when you do that, the air moves down your respiratory system until it goes all the way down to the lung, and then oxygen moves in, carbon dioxide moves out. The blood take that uh, oxygen with low carbon dioxide, take it all the way down to the cells. So at the cells, what's going to happen, and this is what we're talking about today. And what's going to happen is the cells are going to take oxygen in. Oxygen enter to the cells. At the same time, the cells already took sugar, specifically glucose. Most of the time, it's glucose. And the cells are going to use that oxygen to burn the glucose. Why are you burning the glucose? To get the energy. And the currency in energy is ATP. The usable form for storage and usage of energy is ATP. And when the cells take that oxygen and use it to burn the glucose, you end up producing, beside the ATPs, you're producing also the byproduct, which is carbon dioxide and water. So we call that the cellular breathing or the cellular respiration. How is that? Because the cells are taking oxygen, moves in, is in that respiration, and then it's producing carbon dioxide, which will move out, is in that respiration. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So this is respiration. The cells are respirating by taking oxygen in and getting rid of carbon dioxide. In between taking oxygen in and moving carbon dioxide out, you're using the oxygen to burn the sugar and get ATP, and also you produce water. And the water can be used in the cells, or if there is extras, it will be kicked out. Cellular respiration is not only in animals and humans, it's even in plants. But you will say, in plants, cellular respiration, isn't it doing photosynthesis? Yes, photosynthesis is to build and store the nutrients, including nutrients that contain glucose, but and which is called the producer. But does the producer itself need to survive, or just storing the nutrients for us and for the animals? No, themselves, they need to use some energy for themselves. So they do take some of this stored nutrients and take the glucose out of it and burn it just like us. So consumers do cellular respiration only, while producers do cellular respiration plus photosynthesis. So this is an overall picture of the cellular respiration. It's an overview. So this here is all these boundaries. This is the cell. Here is sugar entering into the cells. And here is when you inhale, oxygen moves into the cells. So the green is glucose or sugar that's coming from the food or from the nutrients, and the oxygen is moving into the cells. So now inside the cells, I have both of them, glucose and oxygen. Usually we refer to glucose C6H12O6. It's a ratio of 1 to 1. There are different arrangements that can give you different things, but we just use it as a general term, or as a general structure to refer to glucose. So now what's going to happen? I'm not talking about oxygen now. I'm starting from here. Glucose moved in. And then what? You are in the cytoplasm now. And in the cytoplasm, you're going to break down the glucose. And we call that glycolysis. We actually call it glycolysis. But I'm just trying to break it down into two parts. Glycose lysis. Glucose lysis. Lysis means breakdown. So glucolysis means to break down glucose. If you look at this here, this is a 6 carbon molecule. You're going to break it down into 2 molecules. Each one is 3 carbon. It makes sense. It is 6. You split it into 2. Each one will contain 3. And this that you produced, which is this blue right here, this is called pyruvic acid. That's it for glycolysis. So glycolysis is when you break down glucose into 2 pieces. The 6 carbon molecule of glucose, you break it down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Each one contains 3 carbon. So 2 3 carbon molecule pyruvic acid. And when you do that with glycolysis, you will end up producing other things. It's not just pyruvic acid. So you split glucose into 2 pyruvic acid plus what? That's it. What is the rationale, or what's the idea then? Remember that we are in a cytoplasm now. So beside that, you are making something called NADH, NADH. This is something that's come from vitamins to carry oxygen, basically. And you're also making some ATP. So what's the end products from glycolysis? 2 pyruvic acid, NADH, and 2 ATPs. This part, which is happening in the cytoplasm, this is called anaerobic part because I didn't use oxygen yet. But anything after that. So what's happening now? Now I have 2 pyruvic acid, I have NADH, I have ATP. ATP is going to be used, it will go to the mitochondria, and it's going to be used to produce to be stored as energy for the cells. How about the pyruvic acid and the NADH? Pyruvic acid, it will enter into the mitochondria. So this structure right here, this oval structure here inside the cells, is called the mitochondria. So you will enter into the mitochondria, and the 2 pyruvic acid will come together and enter into another cycle inside the mitochondria that's called citric acid cycle. And now the second cycle after glycolysis, citric acid cycle. So pyruvic acid enter into the citric acid cycle, the 2 pyruvic acids, and now you have the second cycle. Remember that now we are inside the mitochondria. And the important thing to remember here is the mitochondria does not work without oxygen. So here is citric acid cycle that require oxygen. Citric acid cycle will give you end products that you need to remember. Carbon dioxide is 1, NADH and FADH2. What is NADH and FADH2? This is molecules or structures that come from vitamins, and it's just hydrogen carriers. You're carrying the hydrogen. Beside the NADH that we already mentioned that coming from glycolysis, so NADH and another NADH, beside FADH, all of that will go to the next cycle, which is electron transport change. Other than that, you also have carbon dioxide that's produced as an end product, and this we will get rid of it and exhale it out. Now the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, this is where it's a chain of transporting electrons, and when you say electrons, we usually mean hydrogen. So here is hydrogen carriers. All these hydrogen carriers, NADH, FADH2, and another NADH, will go to the third cycle, which is electron transport chain, and this one need oxygen. It doesn't work without oxygen. So when you do that, this is where you get the vast majority of the ATP. Remember that citric acid cycle also gave us another 2 ATPs, and then it will give us these hydrogen carriers or electron carriers to go to the electron transport chain. At this part, this is where we get the vast majority of energy. about 34, 32, 34, depending on the source that you're using. So here is ADP, we'll enter N, and it will become ATP. Obviously, you're storing energy now. Now you have ATP, of course ADP, and you add phosphate to it, and in between the ADP and phosphate to make ATP, but in between the ADP and the phosphate, as you're producing ATP, you will store energy in between in the form of ATP, and the ATP will be used as energy for cells, for this cell, for other cells. It's a usable form of energy anyway. So one more time real quick. Here is glucose enter to the cells. Go to glycolysis, which is number one. Glycolysis happens in a cytoplasm, doesn't need oxygen. What's the end products? 2 pyruvic acid, NADH, 2 ATPs. And then what? And then the 2 pyruvic acid will leave the cytoplasm. Remember, in a cytoplasm, you don't need oxygen. We call it anaerobic. Anaerobic. No air or no oxygen. It means no oxygen. You didn't need oxygen at this point. Now pyruvic acid will go into the mitochondria, both of them, and both of them are going to enter into the second cycle, which is called the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle is happening inside the mitochondria. For the mitochondria to work, it needs oxygen, so everything happening inside this is called aerobic. Aerobic means with oxygen. What are the end products of citric acid cycle? Carbon dioxide, get rid of it. NADH and fed H2, go to the electron transport chain, together with the NADH that's coming from the glycolysis. What else? ATP. ATP will be stored and used as energy carrier. So now the third one, which is electron transport chain, also happening in the mitochondria. It needs oxygen. Here is the red, oxygen coming in. So now you're using the oxygen to get the energy out of those carriers, fed H2 and NADH. When you get that energy, you will end up storing the energy in the form of ATP. You get the ADP and phosphate, and you store it in the form of ATP, and then you store this energy or use it. And you also produce water, because remember that you're using the oxygen and you have hydrogen here. Hydrogen, oxygen is water, and the water can be stay in the cells or you get rid of it. So if you're talking about the whole end products of the whole thing, all of them combined, I got ATP energy, about 36 to 38. I got water, I got carbon dioxide. This is the cellular respiration. So here are the details. What end up happening here is this is glucose, and because it contains 6 carbon, you're going to need 6 oxygen, and end up producing those 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and you get the chemical energy that you're going to use. Comparing that to the photosynthesis, the photosynthesis is the opposite, if you still remember. So here it is, photosynthesis, 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water give you glucose. It doesn't have to be glucose, but we're talking about glucose at this point. On the other hand, now I have the glucose, or I have the sugar. I'm going to use oxygen to burn it into 6 water and 6 carbon dioxide. So us and the plants, or it's basically anything that can do photosynthesis, but mainly the plants, are complementing each other. We break down the glucose into carbon dioxide and water. Plants take the carbon dioxide and water and build it back into glucose. I'm saying glucose for simplification. It's not just glucose, it's other things. But just to make it simple, they take those two, and we talked about the details of doing this, the 2 cycles that the photosynthesis does. But you end up producing glucose and oxygen. We need both of those, and we take it as consumers, and we burn it and get the end products, which are water, carbon dioxide, plus of course the energy that we're going to use, and then the plants are going to take those and rebuild it, and cycle goes on and on and on. We complement each other. But here is one thing that's very important to know. which is not only us, our consumers, even the producers, they do take some of this. They need to survive as well. As a plant, it needs also some energy to survive and to grow. So it's also going to do cellular respiration like us. So it's going but it doesn't use all of it. It just use a little part, and humans and animals are going to take the rest. So here is cellular respiration, 3 stages: glycolysis, and again, glycolysis happen in the cytoplasm. It doesn't need oxygen. We call it anaerobic. Citric acid cycle and electron transport chain, both of these happen in the mitochondria. Citric acid cycle, I talked about this, just reviewing again. Citric acid cycle and electron transport chain, number 2 and 3, both of them happen where? In the mitochondria. So here you take the 2 pyruvic acids and enter them into the citric acid cycle. You end up producing NADH, FADH2, produce 2 ATPs, and carbon dioxide. You're getting only 2 ATPs, small amount of ATP. For glycolysis, you also the same thing. You only got 2 ATPs, small amount. So far I got 2 from glycolysis, 2 from citric acid cycle. This is not a lot. The main will come from the next one, electron transport chain. So electron transport chain also happen in the mitochondria, just like citric acid cycle, but to be more specific, it happened in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. If you look at the mitochondria, it's surrounded by 2 membranes. This chain happen, or transport chain happen, in the inner one. And the high energy electrons that are coming in the form of hydrogen, they are going to come into this cycle, or into this chain, and you get the oxygen to use it to take the energy out. You produce a lot of ATPs. This is the whole remaining part. Like if you make 38, you got 2 and 2 from glycolysis and citric acid cycle, and everything else like 34 or something that you get it from the electron transport chain. And again, electron transport chain, a chain of transporting electrons. You get the hydrogen and you transport in and out through the inner mitochondrial membrane, and you end up producing water. So the overall is carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So we talked in the beginning of this part, we talked about in the spy movies, we talked about the spy pills and how toxic it is. What does it do? Simply, it stops the cellular respiration. If you wanted to know about it, it contains cyanide ions, and cyanide ions is going to attach to the iron part of the cytochrome C oxidase. What's the cytochrome C oxidase? It's one of the enzymes that's working in the electron transport chain, and the problem is this is irreversible. That's why, like, if a spy take that pills and he try to save them, you cannot, because cyanide is irreversible. So once it attached to that enzyme, it's completely stopped, and you cannot do anything about it. So now, if the enzyme is gone, it doesn't do the job. You cannot do electron transport chain. You cannot get all that energy. The cells will die, and the person will die. So the bottom line is, these spy pills, toxic pills, which contain potassium cyanide, it interrupts electron transport chain, which is the main source of energy inside the cells. So you cannot make ATP anymore, and the cells will die. You cannot count on the other two. You cannot count basically on glycolysis and citric acid cycle, because if you get 38 ATPs out of the whole thing, you need it actually. You need the 38. You can get 4 from the other two, but how about the 34 that you don't get? Can you use the 4? Yes, you can use it for some time, but you're not going to survive for a long time. It's just take few seconds. So this next part is about fermentation, another form of burning the nutrients, but in a different way. If you're talking about the beer, we say the beers are carbonated. Why it's carbonated? And because it's carbonated, you see bubbles on the top of the beer, and it usually contain alcohol, and we're going to discuss that. So this is what we discussed so far, which is aerobic respiration. Remember, you burn glucose with oxygen, and you end up getting the energy that you need, 38, plus some carbon dioxide and water that you get rid of. But what if you do not have oxygen? It will become anaerobic. And this is the topic now. Anaerobic. An is a prefix that means no or without. Aerobic, it means air, and we're specifically referring to oxygen. So now what's happening is you still do glycolysis. Are you still doing glycolysis? Yes. Because why? Because glycolysis does not need oxygen. It happens in the cytoplasm. So you will do it anyway. It's not going to be affected if you don't have oxygen. But what's going to be affected is what's happening after that. Pyruvic acid, it's supposed to, if you have oxygen, it's supposed to go to the mitochondria, and you're supposed to enter to citric acid cycle and then electron transport chain, but this is not going to happen because the mitochondria will refuse to work without oxygen. So what is the alternative? This pyruvic acid will be fermented, and we call that anaerobic fermentation. So NADH is going to enter and become NADB, and you give different products that's not the same as this. Now, it's not carbon dioxide, water, and energy. No, this is a different scenario now. You don't have oxygen to do that. So fermentation is anaerobic. Anaerobic means anaerobic, without air. Not literally, it means without oxygen. Are you making a little bit of ATPs? Yes. You get 2 ATPs here from glycolysis, but that's about it. That's it. You do not do the other 2. So out of the 38, you end up making only 2. So you make small amount of ATP, a lot smaller. And if you are talking about this anaerobic reaction that's happening without the presence of oxygen, like if you're exercising too heavily, what's going to happen? If you think about it, like if I want you to exercise really strenuous exercise, at certain point you will say, I need to stop, and then you will stop. You will fall, basically. So if you think about it, what's happening here? Here's what's happening. Glucose entered to your cells, and then glycolysis happen anyway, irrespective of what you're doing. It's anaerobic. You do not need oxygen, whether you're exercising lightly, you're not exercising at all, you're exercising strenuous exercise, it doesn't matter. It will happen anyway. But then what? What's happened to the pyruvic acid? If you're exercising too much, you do not have enough oxygen. So now you're turning a good part into anaerobic. So what's going to happen here? What's going to happen is anaerobic fermentation in human muscles. I'm not talking about the beer part or this part. I'm talking about the anaerobic in humans. What's going to happen here? This is an alternative. You still get some ATP out of this because of glycolysis, but the pyruvic acid basically is going to become lactic acid. Why are you converting pyruvic acid into lactic acid? Here is why. Because if you're exercising and you're not getting enough oxygen, you're doing glycolysis, and glycolysis gives you a little bit of energy, but it's okay to survive temporarily. So now you are breaking down glucose into pyruvic acid, and where is pyruvic acid going? It's not going anywhere. It's supposed to go to the mitochondria, but the mitochondria will not work without the presence of enough oxygen. So as an alternative, your cells will say, okay, what should I do now? Ultimately, the cells will be filled with pyruvic acid. I need energy. I'm getting 2 at a time. 2. So at least I need to continue with that, at least to survive temporarily, until you breathe good and you stop the strenuous exercise. But what should I do temporarily to keep the process going and take the minimum? I'm going to convert that pyruvic acid into lactic acid, and I'm going to send it to the liver. So now the cells are getting rid of the pyruvic acid, emptying a space for another patch of glucose to enter. At least you do glycolysis temporarily, but you produce lactic acid. But the problem is, when you do that for longer time, lactic acid is going to accumulate, and it's going to it's an acid, so you will go into acidosis and you start to feel the pain and you have to stop. So that was in humans. You turn it into lactic acid. And the lactic acid will move into the liver, and the liver will try to change it back, and it will take care of it temporarily until you stop that strenuous exercise. So this is the anaerobic fermentation in humans. How about in yeast? No, the yeast does not do that. The yeast does not form lactic acid. The yeast, when they work anaerobically, they are going to change the glucose. So the glucose will go to glycolysis, but then you're going to change it into ethanol. And ethanol is the alcohol. So this is what's happening. So anaerobic fermentation in humans produce lactic acid. Glycolysis is still working. Anaerobic fermentation in yeast produce a little bit of pyruvic acid, but then what? Or I mean, it produced pyruvic acid, and then what? It's going to change into ethanol. Ethanol is alcohol, and this is what you're forming in yeast, and they use that to produce the beer and the different forms of alcohol. And because of the accumulation of the carbon dioxide, it will make bubbles on the surface. And this is what we see in the beer and other things. Next part is, if you are burning cellular respiration, doing cellular respiration, and you're burning glucose, is it only glucose? Is that the only source? Of course not. You eat different things, different nutrients. What are the types of nutrients that you can that you always eat? Of course, you're not eating only carbohydrates. You eat also fat and proteins. So can we use those in the cellular respiration? You can, but in indirect way. You're going to work around, and somehow you're going to burn these alternatives, fat and protein, not just carbohydrates. So of course you can get ATP out of these other forms. How? Carbohydrate, we talked about it. Like if this glycogen, you break it down into glucose and enter it into the cells, get energy out of it. We understand that. How about fat and protein? You're going also to, you can burn fat and protein, and then somehow you're going to change it into different forms and incorporate that into the cellular respiration, and you still get energy out of it. Here it is. This is just general idea. Like, what else can I eat? You eat carbohydrate. That's okay. We talked about it. Any one of those is carbohydrate. And you get glucose out of that. It go to the cells, glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. We talked about this. What if you're eating fat? You're going to break down the fat into fatty acids. And then the fatty acids will change into pyruvic acid, which is an alternative. So you're bypassing glycolysis now. How about proteins? You're eating meat, you're eating eggs, you're eating anything that have proteins. What's going to happen? You are going to break it down into amino acids, and amino acids somehow are going to be incorporated into the cellular respiration. Amino acid can get incorporated into glycolysis itself. You can switch it, change it into glucose, or it can change to pyruvic acid, or you can transform it into components that can enter into citric acid cycle. We didn't talk about the details of citric acid cycle, and we don't need to, but know that it's a lot of intermediates in between here. Go from product to product to product to product. You can change amino acid into one of these products. More than that would be too much details, but this is good enough to know for this part. So when you say metabolism, generally speaking, what's metabolism? Metabolism is the combination, the sum of all chemical reactions happening in your body at a certain time. Like if I ask you, what's the metabolism right now? You will say, okay, let me count all chemical reactions that's happening right now. All of them together, we call that metabolism. So metabolism is all chemical reactions together. Look at all these together, put them together, and you call that metabolism. Um, so this is for this chapter, which is chapter 4, and this is the end of the second part. And so the chapter 4 is done.